Everybody, welcome in, welcome in. We're gonna go ahead and get this party started. I do have one more chair right here on the front row. If anybody wants to snag it, don't be shy. You can come around this way. It'll be great. But if somebody wants a front row seat, we've got one. Other than that, my name is Kai. I'm the events manager here, and we are thrilled you are with us on this beautiful Tuesday, windy night in Waco, for the celebration of Dr. Beth Barr's new book. Can we give her a hand clap? We are so thrilled to celebrate with her. And we do have a live stream happening tonight as well. So just be conscious of that. But it's going to be great. We have about 50 people tuning in on that page right now and some more hopping in. Obviously, it is a full house tonight, so feel free to wiggle about the cabin to find yourself a cozy spot to lean throughout the conversation. Savannah Locke is with us, is going to be having a conversation with Dr. Barr tonight. They're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you guys to ask some questions. So keep those in your mind, and we'll let you have them. And then afterwards, you each received a little ticket on the way in. We'll do some giveaways and then transition to our book signing. But we're just going to go ahead and get this conversation started, and I will pass it. Oh, and we'll let Dr. Barr introduce Savannah.
Thank y'all. Thank you for coming. I stole the microphone because I want to introduce y'all to Savannah. And for those of you who know about the podcast that was born with this book, yeah, All the Buried Women. So Savannah is actually the brain behind that. She's the one who, I'll let her talk a little bit about it later, but she's my co-host. And I'm so excited that she's came here to do this for me. So.
Thanks. Now back to you. Beth hates the attention being on her, but I'm really thriving on it being on her at the moment. So Beth, we just wanted to start by talking about the story behind this book, because you actually shared it with me today and I thought it was fascinating. So talk about how after Making a Biblical Womanhood blew up, and you said, I never want to be in the limelight again. Why then did the second book come?
Yes, that is true. My initial thought after the Making a Biblical Womanhood was, yeah, that's a one-hit wonder. I'm walking away. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine. His name is Scott McKnight. Some of you may know him. He's a very wise person. And he said, that's fine, Beth, if you don't want to publish. But he said, you have the chance right now that if there's something you didn't say in the Making a Biblical Womanhood, he said, you have the platform to say it. And I thought about that for a while. And one of the things that I had left unsaid in the Making a Biblical Womanhood was women's ordination. And I still, though, I didn't really have a story to go with it. I sort of chewed on that for a little while. And at the same time, I had I don't think I told you this part, I put out on Twitter, sort of like, if I was going to write another book, what would people want me to write about? And I think I got at that time, it was my tweet that went the furthest, got like over 100,000 views. And everybody was like, tell us about being a pastor's wife. And it was, and I was like, well, that's cool, but I don't really want to write a memoir. I really, that didn't really interest me either. And I was teaching a graduate class at the time on women and religion, or I was getting ready for it. I'm trying to remember. Allison's sitting right here. Sorry. Anyway, I was trying to remember. And I was reading a book by one of my colleagues at Baylor, Elizabeth Flowers. And she has this great book called Into the Pulpit, Southern Baptist Women in Power in the post-World War II era. And she has a section in that book where she talks about that the women who were on the front lines fighting against women's ordination were pastors' wives. And that was the moment that I was like, I think I have something to say. So
I've read this book twice, as you know. What for you was the hardest part about writing this book? Like, what was the part that you felt like took the most work to get it out?
There were two parts that I think were super hard. One of them was having a cohesive story, because the book covers 2,000 years of history. It walks from the ancient and the medieval world all the way up to the modern Southern Baptist world. And so keeping a storyline keeping my thesis coherent throughout. In fact, my husband's sitting here in the back. I mean, he can tell you how many times I rewrote one chapter that like went on for forever. Because I was trying to get this. It was actually the middle chapter, the Rise of the Pastor's Wife, which I really like that title because I'm a Star Wars person. So I just want y'all to know that that wasn't accidental. Anyway, but the Rise of the Pastor's Wife, that was the linchpin chapter, and it took me a really long time to get that right. The second part that was really hard to write was the chapter that I didn't know I was going to write until I was in the Southern Baptist Archives, and I ran across the story of a sex abuse case that no one seemed to know anything about. And I followed that story to Toronto, to Canada, and it took me 8 months to kind of piece the story together. And I ended up telling that story. The final chapter is called The Cost of Dorothy's Hats. And it's talking about, for those of you who don't know yet, Dorothy is Dorothy Patterson, who is the wife of Paige Patterson, and they were two really critical figures in the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And she was the queen of what became complementarian theology. And she always wears hats to symbolize her submission to her husband. And so the title of that chapter is The Cost of That Theology. And I tell the story through the wife of a pastor's wife, a woman named Maria. And that was a really hard chapter to write. So I think I got it right. But I think it was my hardest one.
So talk to me a little bit about the way that you see the pastor's wife role intersecting with our culture and how we're thinking about women at the moment and how church is thinking about them. We did not plan these questions, by the way. So if you don't want to answer anyone, just be like, no, and I'll find a new one.
We have been working pretty closely together for a year and a half now. So I trust Savannah. But, I actually saw this, I'm not really a person who reads comments all that much. So I do occasionally, and I saw one, and it was just on a post on Substack, and somebody was like, well, tell me why I should read this book if I'm not a pastor's wife. And part of me was like, well, you don't have to read it. I was like, that's, well, right now it's free country. I was like, you don't have to read it. Sorry. But anyway, I was like, you can do what you want to do. And but then my other thought is that actually this is what people don't realize is how central this pastor's wife role is to this culture that argues that women's God-given role is to be it's in the words of Dorothy Patterson, to hold the ladder for their husbands to climb. And even though, and in some ways the pastor's wife role epitomizes this ideal model of biblical womanhood. And if you think about how many people adhere to complementarian theology, I mean, just think about, Southern Baptist World in 2007, 2008 was around 16 million people. Now they're under 13 million, but that's still a huge amount. And then if you add into all the people who read the Gospel Coalition and Desiring God and all the Reformed, the very conservative Reformed churches like Doug Wilson, you add in John MacArthur, you add in, I won't name any Waco churches, but you add in all of the churches that support complementarian theology, and you think about our world in which women's women's rights are being eroded. And it's like, how did we get here? And the pastor's wife is part of that story. It's a really critical part of that story. So I think that on the one hand, it is kind of a niche topic, but on the other hand, it is a niche topic that I think if people understood how significant what this role is and what it has become, it helps make things make more sense. Like, how did we get here? So.
Can you talk a little bit about the research in your book, where you went through a bunch of books written by pastors' wives? Can you just talk about that research a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll highlight, I don't know where she is, but Brooke Lefevre is sitting in the back. And those of you who have read that, she was one of the graduate students at Baylor who worked with me on this book. Katie Heatherly is another one who is now at Notre Dame. And so Brooke probably read more pastor's wife books than she really ever wanted to. And so what we did, it was Katie who started the project with me. And we created, sort of my thought when I decided I was going to write this book, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what the baseline is for the pastor's wife role. My thought is that probably this very conservative Dorothy Patterson thing is a genre that dominates, but I actually don't have the facts on that. I was like, I don't know that for sure. So I was like, we got to figure this out. And so I said, what we need to do is we need to start, we started creating a database of all of the pastor's wife books that we could really find. And in that database, and then what we started to do is we started to make connections within them, like what are the circles that these pastor's wife books are coming from? And what we found was that indeed this conservative evangelical world is the center of producing these narratives about the pastor's wife role, and that the pastor's wife role grew in significant popularity in this genre. This genre grew alongside the growth of complementarian theology. And you can see that. In fact, if you look at the end of the book, you'll see I have an appendix of all of 150 pastor's wife books, and they're in chronological order. And so you can even follow it and see it for yourself. And then we started looking at what these books were teaching. And again, what we found, and Brooke was one of the ones who helped me do this, is we found what we called a rise in submission language. And this is language, on the one hand, the pastor's wife is just a wife, in Protestant circles. And so there is this continuity where a lot of the things in sort of earlier pastor's wife literature, they talk about things that we would connect with being a wife. But what we saw was a marked shift towards using Bible verses that emphasize the submission of women, as well as verses that emphasize how women are how their job really is to support the job of their husband. And even this language of calling that, and Dorothy Patterson says this, she says that husbands and wives are never called to different things. And so the calling of the husband is also the calling of the wife. So anyway, so that was it was very eye-opening. And I also want to say too, that while this book is a critique, a historical critique, an analysis, I am a pastor's wife. And I've actually been a really happy pastor's wife, because I like doing that more background role. I like stepping in to see where I can help. Some things I like more than others, but I like that. And so this isn't an attack on the role itself. It is actually how this role has evolved in a way that hurts women, not only outside of it, but also in it. And one of the things in these pastor's wife books, you hear the voices of these women who are in this impossible position and trying to justify this role that has no biblical basis, but is so hard, and them trying to figure out how to do it. And so I have a lot of sympathy, compassion, empathy for these women.
Yeah, the book doesn't feel like a condemnation of the role. It feels like an analysis of how the role became. Okay. To me personally. Talk to me about you being a medieval historian, and you wove that in to the book. You found a way to bring the medieval stories in. So talk to me maybe about one or two of them, maybe the geese. Love the geese.
Sure. Y'all are like the geese. What are the geese doing in the pastor's wife book? So again, this is a big story. The last 3 chapters do focus on the SBC. They're my case study, so to speak. But that means that the first 5 chapters don't. The SBC is woven in and out of them, as you will see. But they start telling the story of, first of all, the biblical roles of women. So we start with the early church, the ancient church. I tell a story about when I went on a school trip with my son, who I don't think is here, or else he's hiding if he is. But where I went on a school trip with him, and we went to a place called the Priscilla Catacombs, which are really amazing. And then it moves into the medieval world. And one of the reasons that I wanted to tell the medieval history is because it is in the medieval world that we see a shift in what we know as ordination. And this is something that most people don't know the history of ordination. And in fact, when I say the word ordination, everyone probably is like, oh, well, I know what ordination is. But you know, the thing is that ordination is not a historically stable category, something that has shifted over time. And in fact, given whatever denomination you might be in or have experience with, the way they define ordination is different. Yes, even we learned that, even in SBC. Anyway, but so we started Tracy. So I wanted to tell the story of ordination, of what ordination actually is, because a question that I get all the time is people are like, "Tell me one woman who's been ordained." Just like men, you know, and of course my thought is, well, I can tell you a lot of women actually who have been ordained. But the first thing is how are you defining ordination? And because what I found is that how we define ordination has shifted over time. It has become narrower and narrower and written in a way that specifically excludes women. And the big place where we see this start is actually in the medieval world, in the Central Middle Ages. And so the story that I tell is the rise of what we call clerical celibacy. And this is the idea that medieval clergy in the Western tradition need to be celibate. There's lots of reasons for this. But as they begin to emphasize that in order to be an ordained priest, you have to be celibate, part of the way they did this was by demonizing the female body. So you kind of think like, we think purity culture today is really bad. You think about medieval purity. I mean, I've often almost written chapters that are called, you know, the medieval purity culture. But we have this sort of this fear, this demonization of the female body to protect the male clergy. The problem though, is that a lot of these male clergy did not abide by that celibate status, okay? And in fact, you know, this is another thing I say is that celibacy was never 100% decided throughout. There's always married priests. There's always really good married priests, okay? One of the books that I cite suggests that there's as many of 40% of the clergy in medieval Germany right before the Reformation era were actually married. So this is something they were just kind of sliding under the radar, you know, in their towns. But the clergy who didn't marry didn't always adhere to those standards. And so one of the stories that I tell is a story that I take students to, a place I take students to all the time in London, because I teach a course on suffrage and we talk about the conditions of women's lives. And so I take them to a place in London that is known as it's a pauper's graveyard in which a whole lot of women are buried who people suspect were associated with prostitution. And what's really fascinating about it is that even that this graveyard, and they're called the Winchester geese. And it's in London, and you may be like, why are they called the Winchester? And if you don't, that's fine too. But if you look at the geography, you're like, why are they called the Winchester geese? Well, the reason is because that territory, and it's on the south side of London. It's over where Shakespeare's theater is, the Globe Theater, if you've been over there. And it was the shady part of town. It was where all the brothels were. And in fact, it was called the Suffolk Stews. And the stews were some medieval term for places of prostitution, houses of ill repute. And guess who owned it? The Bishop of Winchester. Thank you, Dr. Beck, Rosalie Beck, sitting right there. The Bishop of Winchester owned it. And so thinking about this, how we have a medieval bishop who's profiting from the sex trade, while at the same time demonizing the female body for this ordained status. And so thinking about how these rules of ordination were written in a way that not only wrote women out, but demonized and harmed them. And so part of the history of ordination is the history of prostitution too. So I'll just let you get to it. Yeah.
Stickies. So talk to me a little bit about when we were doing the Q&A earlier in Facebook. You guys didn't miss anything, but on Facebook they said that this book for you felt like you weren't writing with a critic in your head.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
Okay. So the Making of Biblical Womanhood, although I had absolutely no idea what it was going to do. But at the same time, I also had lived in the circles of complementarian theology, and I knew what all of the criticisms were. So me writing The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I was always hearing the people who would argue with me in my head. And that probably, the way I structured some of the arguments were to address those critics, etc. I did not really think about my critics in becoming the pastor's wife. This is, and part of this is simply because I don't think I'm going to worry so much about those critics anymore. I feel like my scholarship stood the test, and and I have footnotes. So becoming the pastor's wife, the voices that were in my head were the women. They were the women who are living this. They are the women who felt called to ministry and were told instead that their calling was to marry a pastor, and who were not able to pursue ministry because of this. And then they are the women who pay the highest price of all of complementarian theology, and that is in the area of abuse. And that is, and in fact, one of my sections in that final chapter is called In Remembrance of Maria. And she's the woman the story is about. And so, and in fact, I have another thing too. This book is about remembering women and remembering that women have always been called by God and have always served God, regardless of the obstacles around them.
Talk to me a little bit about what you cut out of this book. What did you cut out? What are we missing?
I don't know if we're missing it. There were some things, and my editor was like, I don't think you need this. What is this? There were a few of those. I actually cut out one of the first sections I cut out. I had this whole section on Tabitha. If y'all know who Tabitha is, Tabitha and Dorcas. I'm actually still kind of sad about that section because I thought I really liked it. And Tabitha is an example of a woman who is in a ministry role that is often misunderstood. I think about, in fact, the church that we're at now, we have these Christmas quilts that we put up every year that are left over from the sewing circle that this church had at some point. And those sewing circles are often called Dorcas groups. Some of you may are aware, they're often called Dorcas group, Tabitha. And it's, and which is wonderful. I think it's great. But we have this image that Tabitha is this domestic, wife. She's a widow, but we sort of put that she's this faithful wife who continues doing the work of this domestic work that now just kind of spills out into the broader community. And the fact is that we actually don't know that at all about Tabitha. What we know is that Tabitha is in the center of a ministry circle that's so important that when she dies, they call Peter to come because they're like, we don't know what to do without her. And in fact, some people have argued that the widows may not actually be referencing marital status, but may actually be referencing an office, like the office of elder in the early, yeah. So, I can't say for sure that's what it is. She may actually be a widow, but this is not just a woman who's doing good in her community. This is the woman who is the center of ministry, where she is doing that ministry without a husband. And she's so critical that Peter comes when he is called. He drops everything and comes. And so I had a whole section on Tabitha and she got cut. Maybe I'll do a Substack with that material later. But, part of it is that this book is 86,000 words and I think I was contracted for 60,000 words. So anyway, I was a little bit over anyway.
A little bit overturned. Talk to me about the message that you hope that the readers get from this book.
This is a hard book. I've described it as, for some of you may know that when I decided to do this book, I asked Brazos if I could go ahead and just be contracted to do a third book. Because I was like, I want to finish this. If I'm going to go this far, I want to finish it. And so, the Making of Biblical Womanhood, if I can continue my Star Wars theme here, is the one that surprised everyone, came out of nowhere. And so it's A New Hope. Becoming the pastor's wife is The Empire Strikes Back. It's the hard one, and the end isn't going to leave. It's a hard ending. I'll just put it out there for you. It's hard. It's a hard book. And so my last book, y'all, is going to be Ewoks, and I'm really looking forward to it. So there you are. Savannah, we have to educate you on this. I didn't know that. You've never seen Star Wars. Okay. But what I hope, despite the fact that what I hope, I want people to walk away from this book and realize it didn't have to be this way. There is a different church out there that could have continued to celebrate women serving alongside God. One of the women that we interviewed for All the Buried Women, she's one of the things she said it never occurred to her that people wouldn't support her because she was doing God's work. And it's like, there's a possible world out there where women were always supported in doing whatever ministry they were called to do. And I just can't imagine how the church would be different today if women were always celebrated and supported alongside men, and that men and women work together for the gospel. In fact, I don't know if you've seen my last chapter, but it's called Together for the Gospel. I'm really proud of that also. But indeed, it's this vision of this what the church could have been. So I want people to know what we've lost and what's still possible. And then I hope this book, as hard as it is, I hope it encourages women. I hope it encourages women who are pastors' wives, who are like, why is this job so hard? And have been struggling and feeling like they shouldn't be struggling. I hope it helps make sense to them. I hope this book is for women who walked away from ministry or who were never able to serve in the type of ministry role they felt called to serve, or who did so at huge cost to themselves and their families. I want them to know that God has always called and used women, and that it's not God that's limiting them. It's our I'll let that answer stand. That's great.
You crouching to do Q&A. Okay, she told us to wait for a visual cue, and I did see you come from behind the lampshade. So just go for Q&A time?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I love it. Thank you, Kai. Questions? I will field them. Rosalie.
Yes.
You're an amazing writer. Fundamentally, really great historian. What about missionary wives? That's a totally different genre because traditionally they have been free to do anything on the mission field that was required regardless of gender identity. Yeah.
I'm gonna say that question for the live stream and the mic. Okay. Rosalie just asked, what about missionary wives who on the mission field were able to do a lot of these things regardless of their gender?
So I actually do talk about one missionary wife in the book. She's not one, I learned relatively recently as I was finishing book that she's still in Waco. Well, the daughter is still in Waco. But it's a woman named Peggy Bartley. And she served with her husband in Uruguay from the 1950s until the 1990s. And she was an incredible woman. I actually went through, every year she wrote letters back to the SBC, even though technically her job was home and family or whatever that, they changed the name of that category. So it's like home and church or family and home something. Anyway, but sort of this idea that she's the secondary, she's not actually the one in the job. She's the one who's, supporting. But nonetheless, she sent this report back every year where she talked about all of the ministry that she did, and it was exhausting. And during this time, she's also raising 4 kids. And so, I mean, one of the things I quoted in the book is I quoted one of her letters saying all the things that she was doing. And then she gets to the end of it and she's like, I'm so sorry, I'm not doing enough. It was just sort of this amazing, and some of the things she was doing were certainly things that would not be, probably she wouldn't be able to do over here. But yet in this context, as she's outside of the US, she's able to serve in these roles. And I think for other missionary women, like she did a little bit more what we would consider to be the pastor's wife role, the pastor's missionary wife role. But other missionary women, they, many of them talk about having this whiplash when they got back to the US, because out on the mission field, they were preachers, they were evangelists, they were building churches and running churches, and everybody's applauding them. And then they get back to the US and they're told, we're sorry, but you can only share your testimony. I just shared my testimony last Sunday, but anyway, that's a different thing. But in church, but it's that they were told that was all that they could do. I mean, it's this whole whiplash thing. And I think Rosalie and other people have said this. I think actually part of this is the racism that's built into the Southern Baptist culture. And it's sort of this idea that and we talk about this too in the All the Buried Women podcast, where we explore that the first senior pastor of an SBC church is actually a Black woman. Her name's Drusilla Fordham. And that's a plug to listen to episode 1 if you haven't listened to it yet. But we decide that the way that she got away with it is that she was Black and she was at a Black church. And so the rules were, she was a missionary church. And so it would have been very different if she had been over a white church. And this is the same out on the mission field, that people who don't look like us are not considered to be in that same type of authoritative, sort of. So a white woman could be over a person of color, but she can't be over white men. Yeah. So anyway, I got a thumbs up from the church historian, so I guess I did well.
Yes. In the back, sorry.
My primary audience for your book is people who are kind of in these church spaces. But my aunt is actually a big fan of your work, and she is a total outsider to this, and she picked up your book as an effort to understand some fractions that have happened in our family because of theology like this that she is not a part of, and doesn't understand. And
what would you hope a message would be for someone who's been total outsider to church spaces, but has picked up this book, maybe say a friend or a relative, who is in these spaces, and what message would you hope they take away?
So great question for the live stream. This is why I'm doing it for the live stream, because I'm doubting they're going to be able to hear. Is for people who are outside of church spaces who pick up your book, what is the hope of the message that they'll receive about people inside the church?
This was something that I saw with the Making of Biblical Womanhood, which is probably what you're, in fact, lots of my academic, friends who teach women's studies at other universities, they were like, this book explained my students to me. They were like, they were like, whoa, this all makes sense now. And so I think becoming the pastor's wife will do the same thing, especially for people, a question I get all the time is like, why don't women just leave? I get that. Why don't women just leave? Why don't they just walk out? And I think this book helps understand how enculturated this role, this identity has become, and how women are taught that this is really what God calls them to be. And how challenging it is once you're in this type of space. How do you walk out of it? I can speak from experience. It's very challenging. So I think it'll help people understand that, which I hope too will help people see how they can actually be better, walk alongside their friends and their neighbors who are perhaps going through this, that they will be able to walk alongside them better. And so I hope, that's my hope, is that it will help in that way. So thanks, Anna.
Really quickly, sir in the blue, I'm so sorry because I did cause confusion. That's you. It's your time to shine.
What model in literature or religious writings do we have for man and wife as equal partners all across the board?
Yeah.
Number two question is, since the patriarchal system is alive and well in the Southern Baptist Convention, what's the plan to increase women pastors?
One of the questions was in the SBC, which is a patriarchal system, what plan is in place to encourage women pastors, if any? And then the first one was what model? It was such a smart question that it might have just flipped right over my head. What was what model? Yeah, but you said it.
Are there models for women who serve equally? Absolutely, Charles. Prisca and Aquila. Just put that out there, Prisca and Aquila. I talk about them in my book. In fact, Brooke actually helped point out to me one of the ways that Dorothy Patterson describes Prisca's role, which is just incredible because it's so made up. That's just all there is to say. It's so made up. She turns her into a pastor's wife. And Prisca, all the evidence suggests that she's probably at least equally serving in ministry alongside her husband, or perhaps the dominant partner, in the sense that her husband's the pastor's husband, which I like to kind of imagine. But you clearly see them working together. They take Apollos aside together and teach him. And they're co-workers alongside Paul together. And so I think, we have a model in the Bible of how women and men called to ministry work together. And we have warped that image in so many ways. The second question was, is there a plan to help women who are called to ministry in the SBC? So we have an episode coming up in 2 weeks called Loopholes, which Dr. Beck is going to be in. And I won't give too much away here, but one of the women that we interviewed said one of the loopholes for women in the SBC is they leave. And we are seeing that. I was interviewed for a New York Times article over the summer, so was Greer, about women leaving the church. And it was interesting to me because I watched the Waco response to some of that, and some of the pastors responding, they were like, oh, we don't see that happening in our churches. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. but the evidence shows us that this is happening, and it's going to come for us too. It's going to come for us. It's not always women leaving the faith, but they're going to different churches. They're leaving. And this is the first time in sort of tracking this history where there are more young men converting than women. Y'all, this really historically is huge, because women have always been, you know, the truism that is often true is that women historically have always been the backbone of the church. And what is going to happen in these evangelical spaces where women aren't? So I think they're going to have to come up with a plan, Charles. I will say that one plan is a wonderful organization called Baptist Women in Ministry, which is for women in all sorts of Baptist. Actually, they help any women. They're just like, if you're ordained, we're going to support you and cheer you. I mean, if you feel called to ministry, we're going to support you and cheer you on. And in fact, I started following their Instagram thread a long time ago just because it was encouraging, because all they do is show pictures of women preaching. And it's just amazing. And it's just encouraging to me to see women serving their roles. And so I think that's, you know, one of the plans, I think a plan to help women is to make these women more visible. Because the more we see women serving in these roles, the more we realize that God calls women too. And so anyway, maybe that's a little short answer. Thank you.
Here, it's your time to shine.
I just want to ask, how do you feel like the book will impact women who are in pastoral roles? Both single women and also women who are married. I don't know, I think about a lot, like if we were to ever marry after, be a pastor, like the dynamic of that. I feel like
How do you feel like the book will impact women in pastoral roles?
So I hope it will encourage them, is what I hope. I hope it will also help provide maybe a little bit of a, I don't want to say a blueprint, but show them that there are models for women serving in ministry with their husbands, or with their husbands doing something completely different. Or women who feel called to ministry, who don't feel called to get married. I mean, that's actually one of the things I wanted people to hear in this book, is that marriage has become a central part of Protestantism. Part of that is actually the pastor's role life, you know, with the Reformation, to be a cleric was now to be married, where marriage actually became part of the job description. And that was a historical change. And it really did create the space where single women are not as celebrated, are certainly not seen as equivalent. They're often seen as, oh, well, you couldn't do this, so we'll let you do this. Yeah, sort of thing. Or you could do that because you weren't able to find a husband. You know, that's often the way it's perceived. It's like, this is your consolation prize, sort of thing. And there's not a lot of space for people who maybe are in a life stage where they don't feel called to get married, or just really don't feel called to get married. You know, I think it's fascinating to me that people who are so literal about the Bible forget that Paul said it's better, you know, that if you can be single like me, be single. And I mean, I don't understand why we don't. It's fascinating to me how we ignore that. And so I really hope it helps to recenter that the only biblical role for women and men is to do whatever God calls you to do, I think, because this is what we see in the Bible. We see God calling women and men to all sorts of different things. And it's like, just let us live into that. And so that's what I hope. I hope it helps women live into their callings. So anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for an incredible conversation and for wonderful questions from you guys as well. So I'm gonna have my friend Haley, who's at the very front of the shop and can't see me but can hear me right now. Oh, here she comes to bring the baskets for the raffle prizes. And I'm gonna ask Melody to grab the t-shirts and magnets right there and bring them on over. And yes, we have 16, so we're gonna do this as quick as possible, and we're gonna work as a team to get these items to the people that win them. It's gonna be a blast. We love prizes. Okay, so while Haley's getting those, I wanted to give a shout out to our people who tuned in on the live stream. They don't need to watch 10 minutes of raffle giveaways and a book signing line and chaos. So can we give a good hand clap to the people who joined us online? Thank you so much. We'll click out of you in a second and I'll trim the video later. It'll be a great time. Okay.